The dossier landed on the polished wood of the desk with a report as sharp and final as a pistol shot. The colonel's voice, honed by decades of command, cut through the stifling office air, each word wrapped in razor wire. "Private Samuel Carter," he read, his eyes scanning the damning lines. "You are charged with fraternization with a prisoner of war, dereliction of duty, and intent to marry an enemy national." A heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by the monotonous, lazy hum of the ceiling fan as it carved slow, swirling circles in the oppressive Texas heat. Seated rigidly across the table, Private Carter held his posture, his spine straight against the back of the simple wooden chair. His hands, resting on his khaki-clad knees, were a testament to a life before the army, rough and calloused, bearing the permanent marks of ropes, reins, and hard labor on his family's ranch. They were the hands of a man who built and mended, not of a soldier trained for destruction. "The report states you provided her with a ring," the colonel stated, his tone shifting from declarative to incredulous. "Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Carter replied, his voice low but steady. "Son, she is a prisoner of war," the colonel emphasized, leaning forward, his elbows on the desk. "Do you possess even a fundamental understanding of the gravity of that situation? The breach of protocol? The sheer recklessness?" Carter's jaw muscle tightened, a small ripple of defiance beneath his tanned skin. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." "Then for God's sake, explain it to me." "Why?" The colonel's question was not just an inquiry. It was a demand for a logic that could bridge the chasm of military law. Carter lifted his gaze, and his eyes, the color of the Texas sky just before a storm, met the colonel's stern glare. They were unwavering, clear of guilt, filled with a conviction that transcended regulations. "Because she is a human being, sir," he said, the simplicity of the statement making it all the more powerful. And she said, "Yes." For a long, suspended moment, the colonel was robbed of speech. The bureaucratic certainty of the file in front of him crumbled against the raw, unvarnished truth in the young private's eyes. He exhaled slowly, a weary sound, and pushed the folder away as if it had grown hot to the touch. "God help you, son," he muttered, the words barely audible, a benediction and a condemnation all at once. Outside the office window, the world wavered in the midday heat. The air itself seemed to shimmer and dance above the sun-baked earth. Beyond the multiple lines of barbed wire fence, the women's prisoner compound lay still and silent, baking under the relentless sun. The camp's stray dogs barked listlessly in the distance. A dust devil spun a frantic, solitary dance down the main road, and from somewhere, carried on the hot breeze, came the mournful, lonely sound of a harmonica playing a tune of longing and remembrance. Samuel Carter's journey to this court-martial hearing had begun half a year ago, a story written in stolen glances and hushed words. Her name was Anna Keller. She was a translator from Munich, captured in France with a group of female auxiliaries from the Wehrmacht. She was not the monstrous caricature of the enemy he had been trained to expect. She carried no visible armor of hatred or defiance. Instead, she possessed a quiet, unassailable dignity that remained intact even when she was handed a mop or assigned to dig in the camp's vegetable garden. He first truly noticed her during a routine inventory of rations. He had stumbled over a German word, and her voice, soft but clear, had gently corrected his pronunciation. He had laughed, a genuine, surprised sound. "Guess I'll have to keep learning, Mom." That small, seemingly insignificant exchange became a secret thread connecting them. It evolved from a habit into a ritual, and then, inexorably, into something far deeper and more dangerous. Now in the stark interrogation room, Carter's mind drifted back through the mosaic of moments that led him here. moments that would look like treason on paper, but felt like the only true thing in a world gone mad. He remembered the first time he had made her laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that lit up her serious face when he had tripped over his own tongue trying to ask her in German if she liked horses. He remembered watching her, hidden from view, as she secretly gave her own bread ration to a fellow prisoner who was ill. And he remembered one clear, cool night, seeing her standing by the fence, her face bathed in silver moonlight, humming a soft, slightly accented rendition of Home on the Range that made the familiar song sound like a heartbreaking psalm from a faraway home. But the memory that shone brightest, the one that sealed his fate, was the day he crafted the ring. He had spent hours in the solitude of the maintenance shed, carefully filing a scrap of salvaged aluminum from a wrecked training aircraft. He smoothed its edges, shaped it into a crude circle, and polished it with a ragged cloth until it caught the light, a small, defiant star forged from war's debris. He had carried it in his boot for days, his heart pounding every time he walked, waiting for a moment that felt right in a place where nothing ever was. That evening arrived with a spectacular Texas sunset, the sky ablaze in shades of crimson and gold, the air carrying the faint, sweet scent of mesquite and the promise of distant rain. He found her at their usual spot near the fence during the shift change. "I ain't supposed to give you this," he had said, his voice barely a whisper. She had looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He slipped the small metallic circle through a narrow gap in the chain links. "It's just a piece of something broken," he explained, trying to be made into something that might last. She stared at the object in her palm, her lips beginning to tremble, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You can't," she breathed, a note of panic in her voice. They'll destroy you for this." "I know," he replied, his gaze steady on hers. "But I had to." And then she did the one thing that neither of them, in all their cautious dreaming, had truly allowed themselves to plan for. She closed her fingers around the ring, looked directly into his eyes, and said, "Yes." Back in the stifling present, the colonel finally broke the silence. He snapped the file shut, the sound like a gavel falling. "Private Carter," he said, each word measured and heavy. "You do understand that this single act of sentiment could very well mean the end of your military career. A dishonorable discharge, everything?" Carter gave a single firm nod. "Yes, sir, I understand." "And you still believe it was worth it?" "For what?" The colonel pressed, genuinely perplexed by this calculus. At that, Carter looked down at his own scarred, work-roughened hands, hands that had held the reins of a horse and the stock of a rifle, and now had fashioned a ring that broke every rule. He was silent for a moment, searching for the words. "For something worth remembering, sir," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, a current of restless energy moved through the camp. Whispers snaked through the barracks like wildfire. The American Cowboy Guard had proposed to the German girl. Reactions were a mixed tapestry of disbelief, scorn, cynical laughter, and, from a rare few, a quiet, secret admiration. In the women's compound, Anna sat on the edge of her narrow bunk, the small, cool circle of polished aluminum hidden tightly in her clenched fist. Outside, the first low rumble of thunder echoed across the vast, flat plains, a portent of the approaching storm. And beneath that sound, another, more ominous one began to echo, the steady, rhythmic tread of military boots moving down the corridor. The United States Army was coming for Samuel Carter. The entire affair had its roots in a morning months earlier, when the dust was still thick and the war felt like a distant, abstract thing. The convoy of trucks had arrived at Camp Hearn, their engines groaning, kicking up great clouds of fine red Texas dust that settled on everything. The camp gates swung open, and the reality of a global conflict was delivered onto American soil. These trucks were not filled with battle-hardened infantrymen, but with women, German female auxiliaries, captured clerks, nurses, radio operators, and secretaries from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. Some had been taken in the chaotic retreats from France, others in the rugged hills of Italy. Many of them were startlingly young, their faces pale and etched with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and disbelief. They were the human flotsam of a receding war tide, washed up half a world away in a place they could never have imagined. Private Samuel Carter had been on duty at the gate that day, his Stetson hat tilted against the blinding glare of the sun. At 24, he was broad-shouldered and moved with the easy, grounded grace of a man more accustomed to the back of a horse than the drill field. To him, this assignment felt less like soldiering and more like being a warden in a strange, desolate zoo. When the tailgates of the trucks dropped with a metallic clang, a hushed, apprehensive silence fell over the new arrivals. The women climbed down stiffly, their grey uniforms travel-stained and dusty. They did not meet the guards' eyes with defiance, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness. They looked less like a fearsome enemy, and more like people who had simply run out of war. One of the women, slight of build and disoriented, stumbled as her feet hit the ground. Carter moved on instinct, his hand shooting out to steady her by the elbow. "You all right, Mom?" he asked. She flinched at his touch, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "You call a prisoner Mom?" she asked in halting, heavily accented English. He offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Where I'm from, everyone's a mom or a sir till they prove otherwise." That woman was Anna Keller, 22 years old, born and raised in Munich, a former translator for a Luftwaffe logistics unit. Her eyes, a calm, intelligent blue, held his for a second too long. They were the eyes of someone who had learned the hard way to weigh every word, every gesture, for its hidden cost. Life inside the camp was governed by a strict, unforgiving set of rules. The women were housed in barracks separated from the male prisoners by double fences topped with razor wire. The U.S. Army, vigilant against propaganda and security risks, enforced a policy of absolute non-fraternization. No communication, no exchange of goods, no exceptions. Yet Camp Hearn was a paradox. The prisoners had braced themselves for brutality, for deprivation. Instead, they found orderly barracks, functional latrines, running water, competent medical care, and a mess hall that served meat regularly. The surreal normality of it all was, in its own way, deeply unsettling. One prisoner whispered to another, "This cannot be a prison of war. It must be a trick." Another observed wryly, "The Americans fight with too much kindness. It is confusing." Carter watched as the women slowly adapted. They planted small, defiant gardens of flowers beside the laundry hut. They organized clandestine choir practices, sewing circles, and even impromptu lectures on art and poetry. These were the supposed enemy, and yet, in their struggle to create pockets of beauty and normalcy, they were making the stark camp feel, for the first time, strangely alive. During his evening patrols along the perimeter of the women's compound, Carter would often pause. He could hear their voices lifted in song, old German folk melodies that spoke of forests and rivers far away, mingled with soft, unexpected laughter. In those twilight moments, the music would wrap around him, and he would forget, just for a few precious seconds, which side of the fence he was supposed to be on. It was on one such evening that he found Anna sitting alone near the wire, using a stick to trace shapes in the dusty earth. "What's that you're drawing?" he asked, his voice gentle so as not to startle her. She looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. "A horse," she said simply. He chuckled. "Well, begging your pardon, ma'am, but it don't look much like one." "Then perhaps you should teach me," she replied, and the smile in her eyes was enough to make the barbed wire between them momentarily vanish. From that day forward, he found his patrols lingering longer in her sector. A few words exchanged about the weather, a clumsy attempt on his part to pronounce a German phrase, a story from her about Munich before the bombs fell. In that forgotten corner of a global war, a quiet, forbidden connection began to grow. They were no longer just guard and prisoner, American and German, but simply Samuel and Anna, two young souls adrift, finding an anchor in each other's humanity. As the autumn of 1944 settled over Texas, a peculiar rhythm established itself at Camp Hearn. It was a fragile harmony built on the rigid scaffolding of military routine, but within its confines, small human dramas unfolded. The prisoners worked their assigned tasks, earning meager canteen credits. The guards, many of them draftees from farms and small towns, began to shed their initial suspicion. The enemy gradually became familiar faces with names and stories. Anna, due to her language skills, was assigned to the camp's administrative office, sorting mail and translating documents. Carter saw her frequently, but always at a distance, always under the watchful eyes of others. He noticed the quiet grace with which she carried herself, the rare, genuine warmth of her smile, the way she would sometimes sit by the fence at dusk, sketching secretly in a small notebook. Their interactions remained small, fleeting, but laden with meaning. He once brought her a book, an English primer, under the pretext of helping her with the language. She, in turn, once dropped a folded piece of paper in his path, a beautifully rendered sketch of his Stetson hat, with a few words written beneath in German. An einem anderen Ort, vielleicht. In another place, perhaps. The camp, against all odds, developed a sense of community. The prisoners cultivated a large vegetable garden. They painted murals on the mess hall walls. On Sundays, hymns in both German and English would rise together into the Texas sky. And Carter, with his guitar, became a part of the camp's nighttime soundtrack. He would sit under the stars and play soft cowboy ballads, and from the women's barracks, gentle voices would sometimes join in, weaving their accents into the familiar melodies. But this fragile piece was built on a foundation of risk. A by-the-book sergeant named Haskins began to watch Carter with a predator's patience, noting the lingering looks, the slight deviations in his patrol route. He pulled Carter aside one evening, his voice a low warning. "Keep looking at that German girl the way you do, cowboy, and the brass will nail your hide to the wall. You're dancing on the edge of a court-martial." Carter knew the sergeant was right. The rules were clear and the penalties severe. Yet his heart, once opened, refused to obey orders. The distance he tried to keep only made the connection feel more urgent, more real. The tension between duty and desire stretched taut within him. The breaking point came on a night threatened by a gathering storm. The sky turned a bruised purple, and lightning fractured the horizon. Carter, on duty, stood his ground in the rising wind, his rain slicker plastered to his body. He saw Anna at her barracks window, her silhouette a still point in the chaos, her gaze fixed on him through the sheeting rain. He walked closer, the fence now the only thing separating them. "You should not be here," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Then stop looking at me like that," he replied, his own voice rough with emotion. She gave a sad, small smile. "I cannot." In the sudden, brilliant flash of a lightning strike, their eyes met, laying bare everything they had left unspoken. The following day, unable to stay away, he passed her the makeshift ring. The glint of metal was seen, the gesture reported. The machinery of military justice began to turn. His confinement and subsequent tribunal were a blur of stark rooms and stern faces. Captain Harlan, almost pitying, offered him a chance to recant, to frame it as a momentary lapse. But Carter stood by his truth. "I've seen enough hate to last a lifetime, sir," he told the tribunal. "I won't apologize for showing a little kindness." The sentence was reassignment to Camp Swift, a form of exile. The morning of his transfer was cold and clear. As he was loading his duffel into the army truck, he saw her. Against all regulations, she was there, by the fence, having seemingly appeared from nowhere. The guards, perhaps touched by a humanity of their own, looked away. "You are leaving," she said, her voice cracking. "Reassigned." He confirmed. "Because of me? Because of what we are." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held his gaze with a fierce intensity. She reached through the cruel barbs of the fence, and he met her hand with his own, the wire biting into their skin, a physical testament to the pain of their separation. "Let me say it clearly so you can hear it," she whispered, her voice firming with resolve. "I would have said yes." He felt his own breath catch. "Then that's enough for me. That's all I'll ever need." As the truck engine roared to life, she pointed toward a cowboy from a neighboring ranch, leading a horse along the perimeter. Understanding her unspoken gift, Carter, in one last act of defiant freedom, walked to the horse, swung into the saddle, and for a few glorious moments rode along the fence line. Not as a prisoner being transferred, but as a man, saying goodbye to the woman he loved under the vast Texas sky. His time at Camp Swift was a gray purgatory of silence and routine. He wrote her letters, dozens of them, pouring out his heart onto paper, but he never had an address to send them to. He learned, through the camp's rumor mill, that the German prisoners were being repatriated. He tried, desperately, to find out if Anna was among them, but the army's bureaucracy was a sealed vault. After the war, Carter was discharged and returned to the family ranch. He rebuilt his life, but he never married, never forgot. The small aluminum ring and her final note remained his most cherished possessions, a sacred relic from a time when love had dared to cross battle lines. Years later, in 1960, a miracle arrived in the mail, a declassified letter from the archives, a piece of paper she had written before her repatriation. "To the soldier with kind eyes," it began. "They are sending us home. But you should know, the light in Texas was the first time I remembered what peace felt like. If the world ever becomes gentle again, maybe we will meet under that sky. Anna." He rode out to the site of the long-vanished Camp Hearn. The fences were gone, the barracks returned to dust. Only the wind and the memory remained. Kneeling on the earth where their fence had stood, he took the ring from his pocket and pressed it into the soil. "This is where it belongs," he whispered to the whispering grass. "Where it started." The story of Samuel Carter and Anna Keller was never recorded in official histories. It became a local legend, a whispered tale of a cowboy and a prisoner, a testament to a simple, profound truth that outlasted the war itself. That while armies can build fences to hold bodies, no power on earth can ever truly imprison the human heart. Their love story became a quiet, enduring monument to the fact that compassion, in the face of absolute division, is the most powerful form of defiance there is. The years after he pressed the ring into the Texas soil were long and quiet, yet filled with a peculiar, persistent hope. Samuel Carter became a fixture in his corner of Texas, a man known for his quiet competence and a sadness that seemed to deepen around the edges at sunset. He ran the ranch with a gentle hand, the same hand that had once held a rifle, strummed a guitar for a captive audience, and fashioned a ring from war's debris. He never spoke of Anna, but she was in everything he did, in the way he'd sometimes pause, his gaze drifting eastward as if he could see across the ocean and the years, in the way he treated every person, friend or stranger, with a fundamental dignity he'd learned behind barbed wire. He kept her letter and the unsent ones he had written at Camp Swift in a small, lockable metal box that had once held .50 caliber ammunition. It was a strange reliquary for a love story. On the anniversary of their parting at the fence, he would take the box, saddle his oldest and calmest horse, and ride out to the site of Camp Hearn. He would sit on a weathered rock and read the words, "The light in Texas was the first time I remembered what peace felt like." The words were a balm and a wound, a connection that time and distance could not sever. The world changed around him. The 1960s rolled in with their turbulence and transformation, but the ranch remained an island of relative stillness. He got older, his hair silvered at the temples, the lines on his face deepened like dry riverbeds, but the image of Anna, 22, with calm blue eyes and a voice that could gentle a spooked horse, remained as vivid as yesterday. In the spring of 1972, a chance encounter shattered the quiet rhythm of his life. A university historian from Austin, a Dr. Eleanor Vance, was in the area conducting research for a book on the POW camps of Texas. She had tracked down a few former guards and prisoners, piecing together the human stories behind the official records. Someone in town, remembering the whispers, pointed her in the direction of Samuel Carter. She found him mending a fence post, his movements slow but sure. He was wary at first, his old instincts for privacy surfacing. But Dr. Vance was persistent and respectful. She didn't ask about rumors. She spoke of the camp's layout, the daily routines, the strange, shared humanity that sometimes flourished in those unlikely places. "They weren't what we expected," Carter finally said, leaning against the fence, his eyes losing their focus, looking into the past. "They were just people. Scared, lonely, a long way from home." "I've been corresponding with a few former prisoners in Germany," Dr. Vance said carefully, watching him, trying to get both sides of the story. There was one woman, a translator from Munich. Her memories were particularly vivid. Carter went very still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the grass. Her name was Anna Keller. The historian continued softly. The name, spoken aloud by another person after nearly 30 years, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had to steady himself against the fence post. "Is she—" he began, his voice rough. "Is she alive?" "She is," Dr. Vance said, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. "She lives in a small town outside Munich. She never married either. She works as a librarian." The historian hesitated, then added, "She told me a story once about a kind-eyed Texan with a guitar and a ring made from aluminum." The following weeks were a blur of a different kind of tension, far worse than any court-martial. Through Dr. Vance acting as an intermediary, a letter was exchanged. His hand trembled as he held the envelope with foreign stamps. The handwriting was older, more assured, but unmistakably hers. "Dear Samuel," it began. "When the historian found me and spoke your name, I felt as if the earth had shifted beneath my feet. I have carried the memory of Texas and of you with me every day of my life. The light, the heat, the sound of your guitar on the night air. It was not a prison to me, but the place where I learned that love does not recognize flags or fences. Life after the war was difficult. Germany was in ruins, and there was much shame and sorrow to bear. But in the quiet of the library where I work, I found a kind of peace. I often looked at maps of Texas, trying to imagine your life. The ring you made, I could not keep it. Before we were repatriated, we were searched. I knew they would take it from me, so I gave it to the chaplain, with a note, hoping against hope it might find its way back to you. It seems it did. That you kept it all these years, it tells me everything I needed to know. The world has become a little more gentle, Samuel. Is it too late for us to meet under that sky?" With all my heart, Anna. It was not too late. The correspondence that followed was a floodgate opening. They wrote of their lives, their losses, their small joys. They carefully, tenderly began to build a bridge across the ocean and the decades. The past was a country they both knew intimately. The future was a terrifying, glorious blank page. 6 months later, Samuel Carter, in a suit he hadn't worn in 20 years, stood at the airport in Frankfurt, Germany, his heart pounding like a young man's. The wait was an eternity. And then he saw her. She was walking toward him, her hair now an elegant silver, her frame a little softer, but her posture was still straight. And her eyes were the same calm, intelligent blue that had seen straight into his soul in a Texas prison camp. She stopped a few feet away, a shy, wondrous smile on her face. "Anna," he said, the word a prayer, a benediction, a homecoming. "Samuel," she replied, her voice still carrying that faint, musical accent. The soldier with kind eyes. He closed the distance between them. There was no barbed wire now, no guards, no rules of war. He took her hands in his still rough and calloused, hers now softened by years of turning pages. They were just a man and a woman, finally free. "I believe you had a question for me," she said, her eyes glistening. "All those years ago." Samuel Carter, the cowboy from Texas, looked at the woman he had loved across a war and a lifetime, and he asked her, properly this time, with no fence between them. "Anna Keller, will you marry me?" Her answer was the same, but now it was filled with the weight and joy of a promise fulfilled. "Yes, Samuel, yes." They were married in a small civil ceremony in Germany, with Dr. Vance and a few of Anna's library colleagues as witnesses. A few months later, he brought her home to Texas. Anna Keller stepped onto the soil of the ranch, under the vast, familiar sky she had remembered for so long. The light was just as she had described it, soft as forgiveness, warm as a promise. The local legend of the cowboy and the German woman was no longer a story of loss and longing. It became a story of a second chance, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Samuel and Anna Carter spent their remaining years together on the ranch. He would play his guitar on the porch at dusk, and she would sit beside him, her head on his shoulder, her hand in his. Sometimes she would hum along, her accent still wrapping around the old cowboy ballads, making them sound new and whole and complete. The ring he had pressed into the earth was gone, returned to the land that had witnessed their beginning. But it didn't matter anymore. They had found what it was meant to symbolize. Not a secret promise, but a life lived openly, freely, and together. The war had ended long ago, but their peace had finally begun.